Bill had believed that as long as he kept Hayley in his arms, everything would seal itself shut like a door slammed hard enough to drown out the noise of the past. But the harder he tried to close it, the more clearly he heard the hinges screaming inside his head, the sound of a life being shoved toward yet another wrong choice. Hayley came home from the hospital wearing a fragility that looked almost too perfectly arranged. The bruise on her skin like a staged cry for help designed to strike straight at his protective instinct. Bill stared at that bruise as if it were proof that the world was plotting to steal what he had just won, and that feeling alone gave him permission to ignore every detail that didn't fit. He hated admitting it, but sometimes he didn't protect Hayley out of pure love. He protected her because he needed to prove he still had power. Still had the ability to be the right man after far too many times being the wrong one. The fury inside him wasn't only aimed at the person who had attacked Hayley. It was aimed at everyone who had ever looked at him like a failure. Aimed at the old guilt that kept bleeding whenever he thought about his previous choices. And so, when Hayley sniffled and Lynette stood beside her with the properly panicked posture, Bill chose to believe the easiest picture, the one that gave him the clearest role. The husband who protects his wife, the predator hunting the culprit. He didn't realize that the very role he clung to was turning him into prey in someone else's story. Lynette was already standing at the edge of that story, not as a harmless attendant, but as someone who could rotate an entire room with a single glance. She appeared at the right moments, said just enough, did precisely the right things to become necessary, and that necessity made it nearly impossible for Bill to push her out of the house, out of his life, out of the private meetings inside his mind. Bill bristled when Hayley let Lynette touch things that belonged only to the two of them, from paperwork to small decisions, but he strangled that irritation with a reason that sounded noble. Hayley was weak, Hayley needed care, and he couldn't be there every second. He didn't see that every time he excused it. He surrendered another inch of ground to Lynette, and the more he surrendered, the more he had to convince himself he was doing the right thing, because if he didn't, the entire foundation under his feet would collapse. That was why Bill's anger became strangely double-edged. It was both a fire meant to protect and a veil of smoke that blinded him to the pieces slipping out of alignment. Hayley, meanwhile, lived stretched thin as a violin string. She knew how to craft the image of a wounded woman, knew when to stay silent so Bill would fill the gaps with his own imagination, knew when to tremble so Bill would draw the conclusion for her. But the longer she performed, the more she realized some things couldn't be controlled with a few simple lies. She had once believed deception was only a tool, only a key to unlock a new door. Then she could toss the key away and keep living. But that key had jagged teeth, and every time she turned it, it carved a deeper line into her. There were nights when Hayley lay awake, listening to Bill's footsteps pacing through the house like the movement of an agitated animal, hearing the phone buzz and die, hearing Lynette whisper somewhere in the dark like wind slipping through a crack. Hayley sensed the coming storm wasn't arriving from some stranger on the street, but from what she had dragged into the house the moment she believed she could rebuild her life through marriage. That instinct wasn't only fear of exposure, it was fear of being pulled back to the exact place she had fled. A filthy past, names that still carried weight, transactions. Moments when right and wrong were traded with a signature or a falsified statement. She wondered whose insane idea this mess truly was hers, for believing she could steer Bill with manufactured fragility, or Lynette's, for being far too practiced at using crisis as a noose. Hayley began to see that Lynette understood Bill more than she had ever suspected, not with affection, but with a predator's instinct. Lynette saw in Bill a pride that bruised easily, and she fed it exactly what it needed to ignite the sense of danger, the sense of an enemy, the sense that he had to strike before something was stolen from him. Lynette carried a cold kind of rage, not the explosive sort, but the kind that accumulates like ice at the ocean's floor, heavier the deeper it sinks. She had hidden too much for too long, played the loyal role too many times, swallowed stories she knew would burn everything down if they ever escaped. At first she concealed things for profit, for money, for debts, for the time she helped Hayley slip out of trouble. Then she hid them out of fear that Hayley would turn and dump every sin at her feet, fear that Lynette would become the sacrifice so someone else could survive. And eventually she hid them for something even more dangerous, the habit of holding other people by the throat. When she knew someone's secret, she felt she mattered. She felt she had power. But that habit was exhausting too. It made her feel chained to Hayley like a shadow unable to separate from the body that cast it. When Hayley stepped into Bill's life, Lynette saw both opportunity and threat. The opportunity was Bill's money and influence. He could become a wall that sheltered them or a blade that severed every tie. The threat was that Bill wasn't like other easy marks. Bill was aggressive, proud, and if he ever realized he'd been used as a pawn, he wouldn't only take revenge, he would crush. Lynette saw in Bill's eyes a violence that didn't require fists, the violence of power, of decision, of the ability to erase someone with a single call. She craved it and feared it at once. And during the days of Hayley's hospitalization after a robbery, Lynette pushed everything one step further, as if she needed to prove she wasn't merely trailing behind Hayley, but controlling the game. Yet the more she pushed, the louder one question echoed in her head, the question she hated most. If Hayley flipped the script, who would be thrown forward first to take the hit? Everything started to tighten into a knot when small details appeared again and again like needle pricks. A hospital employee hinted that Hayley seemed to come at a moment when panic would have made more sense. A vague incident report about the robbery that lacked clear witnesses. A handbag that hadn't been stolen at all, even though Hayley insisted someone had targeted something important. Bill wasn't a fool. He had lived in a world where people lied as naturally as breathing, where every smile came with a price tag. He noticed the cracks, but what enraged him most was that he couldn't tell whether he was looking at cracks in the story or cracks in his own trust. His anger began to consume itself. He wanted to believe his wife, because belief meant he still had the ability to hold a family together, still had the chance to start over. But he also knew people often don't believe because something is true, they believe because they need it to be true in order to keep living. Bill started clutching at every unfavorable sign like thorns, not to pull them out, but to remind himself he was under threat. And when he felt threatened, he became dangerous. Instead of confronting Hayley directly, he quietly examined the web around her. He looked at Lynette as a side door into the truth. He didn't trust Lynette, but he assumed she would slip first because she didn't have the one thing that softened him the way Hayley did. Bill began to suspect Lynette and warn Hayley to keep her distance, but the warning triggered the opposite. Hayley clung to Lynette more tightly, as if to the only person who knew how to save her if the truth cracked open. And Lynette, forced into the role of the suspected one, grew sick of being a shadow. She began to imagine exposing everything not for morality, but for revenge and release. She wanted to shove Hayley down to save herself, but she knew if she shoved too hard, she would fall too. That conflict drove Lynette mad in a silent way. She became sharper, more volatile, her eyes always calculating the next move. And that very state made Bill even more certain she was hiding something. Inside Hayley, betrayal became the greatest terror. She had once believed betrayal was something other people did to her, something she could anticipate and defend against. Now she realized betrayal could come from her own hands, because she had used Bill as an escape route, turned his feelings into a shield. She looked at Bill and saw a man losing himself because of her. His anger no longer felt like warm protection, it became a blade cutting them both. Every time Bill snapped over a small detail, Hayley felt as though she stood before a locked door, and the only key sat in Lynette's hand. She wondered if Lynette, exhausted by the cover-up, would throw Hayley to the wolves to buy her own survival. Hayley pictured the day Lynette would walk into the room and stop pretending to be loyal, would smile like a victor, would list every moment they had been partners in crimes that could never be aired. Staged thefts meant to claim insurance money, meetings with men they should never have met, money that passed through Lynette's hands to be washed clean, statements edited with a wink. Hayley didn't need to remember every detail. She only needed to know they existed. like ropes already hanging from the ceiling. And now each day, those ropes dropped a little lower. Lynette carried an old wound too, one that made her react violently the moment she felt betrayed. If the slap that once happened wasn't random, it had to come from a moment when Lynette realized Hayley had chosen her own benefit over Lynette's sacrifice. Maybe long ago Hayley had promised they would disappear together after a job, but only one of them truly got to leave safely. Lynette stayed trapped with the consequences, with the debt collectors, with her name written on a list. Hayley might have turned her back, and Lynette swallowed the humiliation just to survive. After that, Lynette stopped believing in loyalty. She believed only in control. And when Hayley entered this marriage, Lynette saw a chance to reset the balance, if Hayley had Bill. Then Lynette needed a piece of Bill to at least a share of the power that would keep her from being abandoned again. But that ambition shoved Lynette into a tightening corner. The more she inserted herself, the more Bill watched her. The more he watched, the greater the risk she would slip. The more she slipped, the more she wanted to burn everything down so no one would get peace. Bill became trapped between two images of himself. One Bill wanted to be a husband to believe, to hold on, to keep. The other Bill had been trained by life to survive through suspicion, to demand control, to strike before betrayal. He looked at Hayley and saw both, victim and manipulator. He looked at Lynette and saw both, frantic helper and knife holder in the dark. Every time he tried to choose, he realized he was choosing what he wanted to believe, not what was real. And the awareness made him angrier, because it made him feel weak. Weakness was the one thing Bill hated most. He began searching for special solutions and official routes because he wanted the truth fast, wanted a punch in place of long, dragging questions. He reached out to someone who could do dirty work without leaving clean fingerprints, and in doing so he crossed an important boundary. From a man being deceived into a man willing to do wrong so he would never be deceived again. He told himself it was for Hayley, but deeper than that, it was for the wounded ego that refused to accept being led by the nose in his own home. When Randy delivered a harsh warning to Lynette, it wasn't just a moral lecture or a family boundary reminder, it was a sign that someone else had spotted the thread. Lynette understood immediately. People like her survive on instinct. One warning that lands too precisely is enough to know the clock is running out. She began weighing the cruelest path, shoving Hayley forward first, offering Bill a piece of truth in exchange for her own safety. Yet the moment that thought formed, Lynette saw the other danger. If Bill learned Hayley had been a con artist, he wouldn't stop at leaving her. He would destroy her. And if Bill destroyed her, Lynette would be dragged down too, because the two women had been tied to the same rope for too long. Lynette stood at a crossroads. Keep hiding so they both stayed alive in fear, or expose everything so one of them died and the other had a chance to live. She hated Hayley, but she hated even more the feeling of being forced to choose. That rage turned Lynette into someone capable of extremes, and the very possibility of extremity made the air around her thicken. In those days, Hayley began to feel the past like a figure standing at the far end of a hallway. She couldn't see its face, but she knew it was coming. Maybe it was someone they had cheated, someone who lost money, someone whose reputation had been ruined. Maybe it was a debt never fully paid, a document still existing somewhere, a security camera clip that hadn't been erased. Hayley understood that a few simple lies were no longer enough. Because the problem no longer lived in the question of who had attacked her, it lived in the question of who had built this entire life out of deception. She began to want to tell Bill the truth, not because she craved purity, but because she wanted control over how the truth would explode. But telling the truth was a gamble too. Bill might forgive or Bill might become the storm itself. And Hayley had never been sure she truly understood how much Bill loved her, or whether he only loved a version of her that made him feel victorious. She feared that if that picture shattered, Bill would have no reason to keep her. That inner conflict wrecked her. She wanted to cling and run at the same time, to strike Lynette first before Lynette struck her. She realized an accomplice isn't just someone you do wrong with. An accomplice is someone who holds you hostage through what they know. And once a secret becomes a chain, partnership turns into hatred. Bill would have to choose eventually, but it was no longer as simple as deciding whom to trust. It was a choice about what kind of man he wanted to become. If he trusted Hayley, he might keep the family he was desperate to build, but he would have to live with the possibility he'd been fooled. If he trusted Lynette, he might touch the truth, but he would be the one to shatter what he had been protecting. And there was a third option, the most dangerous of all: trust no one, treat both women as enemies, and use power to grind everything to dust so no one could ever hurt him again. Inside Bill, anger was winning, because anger was easier than facing the fact that he might have been wrong. He began acting like a man who had decided before the evidence arrived, and that made the entire house feel like it was waiting for an explosion. Hayley looked at Bill and saw a man transforming into the very thing she had once fled, someone who didn't accept people, only accepted power. Lynette looked at Bill and saw both her final tool for escape and the crushing machine that could obliterate her. Three people stood inside the same story, each pulling the rope in the direction they wanted. And that rope was tightening to the point that one more hard tug would snap it and whip back to cut every face in the room. In the quietest moment, Hayley felt it with chilling clarity. The past wasn't returning merely to collect payment, it was returning to choose who would pay. And what froze her blood was not knowing whether the chosen one would be her, Lynette, or both. Bill stood at the center like a judge who refused to admit he was also the defendant. He could believe his wife, or only believe what he needed to believe, but the truth was still approaching in a way that didn't require his permission. And Lynette, sensing control slipping away, began thinking about the final move of someone backed into a corner, flipping the table. Because if Lynette truly grew sick of hiding, if she decided to expose everything to save herself, then the only thing left that could determine Hayley's fate wouldn't be lies or tears, it would be the speed of Bill's reaction when he realized the person he had been protecting might be the one who had always been stabbing him from the shadows.